I found out my best friend had stolen my company while I was standing in a bank lobby, holding a pen I didn't need anymore, smiling at a loan officer who kept referring to me as the owner of a business that, according to the documents in front of her, no longer belonged to me. My name is Caleb Mercer. I'm 39 years old, and until recently I co-owned a custom fabrication shop in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The other half belonged to Trevor Vance, a man I had trusted since we were both 22, broke, and convinced that working hard was enough to guarantee success. We built Mercer and Vance from nothing, just a rented garage behind a failing tire shop, into a legitimate operation with 15 employees, steady contracts, and a reputation for solving problems other shops wouldn't touch. Trevor handled people. I handled everything else. That was the balance we believed in. He was the one who could talk his way into deals, shake hands with city officials, charm inspectors, and leave every room with someone convinced he was indispensable. I was the one who stayed late, who checked measurements twice, who knew every machine by sound alone. I remembered birthdays, fixed mistakes quietly, and kept things running. For 17 years, I thought that division made us strong. Now, I understand it made me blind. The meeting at the bank was supposed to be routine. We were applying for a line of credit to expand into municipal work, railings, infrastructure, bigger contracts. Trevor had assured me everything was ready. He always handled the paperwork, the filings, the legal details I hated dealing with. I trusted him to do it right. I trusted him completely. The loan officer, Marcy, had a calm voice and a professional smile that started to falter halfway through our conversation. She slid a folder toward me and asked me to confirm my relationship to a company called Vance Industrial Holdings. I almost laughed. It sounded fake, like something out of a bad crime movie. I told her there had to be a mistake. Our company was Mercer and Vance Fabrication. Always had been. She hesitated, then explained that Mercer and Vance had been dissolved 6 weeks earlier. Its assets had been transferred to Vance Industrial Holdings through a signed authorization. My ownership stake, she said carefully, had been bought out for $1 under a separation agreement bearing my signature. That was the moment everything shifted. My ears rang. My hands went cold. The room felt distant, like I was watching it happen from somewhere else. I asked to see the paperwork. When she turned it toward me, I saw my name written in blue ink, close enough to pass at a glance, wrong enough that I knew instantly it wasn't mine. The letters were too careful, too practiced. Someone had studied how I signed my name. I didn't react the way people expect. I didn't yell or accuse anyone. I took pictures of what I could, thanked Marcy, and walked out into the cold. My truck was where I left it. Windshield cracked, coffee still sitting in the holder. I sat there for a long time, staring at the logo on my jacket, realizing my own name was now attached to something I no longer owned. The betrayal didn't hit all at once. It came in pieces. Memories of Trevor at my mother's funeral, standing beside me like family. Trevor at my wedding, raising a glass and talking about loyalty. Trevor insisting on handling paperwork because he knew I hated it. Every moment I had trusted him replayed differently now. When I got back to the shop, his office was empty. Not obviously stripped, just cleared. His laptop was gone. His notebook was gone. The safe was open and empty. It wasn't sudden. It had been planned. That's when I understood the truth. This hadn't happened overnight. Trevor hadn't betrayed me in a single moment. He had done it slowly, carefully, over time, and I had never seen it coming. The drive home from the bank should have taken 20 minutes. It took almost an hour because I kept pulling over, turning off the engine and staring through the windshield as if the right answer might be waiting in the next parking lot. Every time I convinced myself there had to be a mistake, I remembered Marcy's expression. She hadn't looked confused. She had looked sorry. When I finally got home, Hannah was helping our 12-year-old daughter, Maisie, study at the kitchen table. Flashcards were scattered everywhere, and the smell of garlic bread filled the house. It was the kind of ordinary evening I usually looked forward to. That night it felt like I had walked into someone else's life. Hannah took one look at me and quietly sent Maisie upstairs. The moment we were alone, I pulled out my phone and showed her the photographs from the bank. She didn't interrupt while I explained the dissolved company, the forged signature, or the transfer of every asset into a corporation called Vance Industrial Holdings. When I finished, she zoomed in on the signature and studied it for nearly a minute. "It looks like your signature," she finally said. "It isn't." "I know." She handed the phone back. "It looks like what Trevor thinks your signature looks like." That sentence stayed with me because it explained Trevor better than anything else could. He didn't copy details, he copied expectations. He understood that people rarely questioned paperwork that looked familiar. If something felt official, they accepted it without looking closer. I called our attorney, Louis Feld, that evening. He had helped Trevor and me form Mercer and Vance almost 2 decades earlier. Louis wasn't emotional. If he sounded concerned, it meant the situation was serious. He asked me to email every document I had photographed. Less than 2 hours later, he called back. "Caleb," he said, "this wasn't done quickly." "What do you mean?" "I mean, whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing." He explained that every filing appeared legitimate. The company dissolution had been accepted by the state. The ownership transfer had been recorded. Insurance policies had already been updated. Vendor accounts had been reassigned. Payroll records had changed. Even the tax information had been amended weeks earlier. Then he asked a question that made my stomach sink. "Who handled the corporate paperwork?" "Trevor." "The banking?" "Trevor." "The accountant?" "Trevor." "The annual filings?" "Trevor." There was a long silence before Louis spoke again. "He controlled every document that proves ownership." Until that moment, I had never realized how much responsibility I had handed him over the years. I always told myself we were dividing the workload. I built the business while Trevor handled the administrative side. It had seemed efficient. Now it felt like I had spent 17 years handing him the pieces he needed to erase me. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I drove to the shop before sunrise. The building looked exactly the same. My name was still on the sign. The parking lot still had the same potholes. The loading dock still held yesterday's steel delivery. For a second, I almost convinced myself everything could still be fixed. Then my keycard flashed red. I tried again. Red. Again. Red. I was still standing there when Pete Alvarez pulled into the lot. Pete had worked with us for 9 years. He rolled down his window and smiled. "Morning, boss." I forced a smile back. My badge stopped working. His expression changed immediately. "You didn't see Trevor's email?" "What email?" Pete looked uncomfortable. "He said you were taking some time away because of health issues. Asked everyone to respect your privacy." Health issues. It was almost brilliant. Trevor hadn't told people I had quit. He hadn't accused me of stealing or losing my mind. He had chosen the one explanation nobody questions. If I came back angry, I'd look like a stressed man refusing to accept reality. Pete unlocked the door for me anyway. Inside, the shop sounded exactly as it always had. Welders sparked, forklifts beeped. Someone had country music playing in the fabrication bay. The business was alive. It just wasn't mine anymore. A few employees nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. News had clearly spread, but nobody seemed to know what to believe. I walked toward my office. The door was open. Trevor was sitting behind my desk, drinking coffee from the mug my daughter had painted for me years earlier. He looked up, smiled calmly, and acted as though he had been expecting me. "I was hoping you'd come in," he said. His voice was steady, not nervous, not guilty, confident. That was the moment I understood something I should have realized years earlier. Trevor wasn't reacting to the situation. He was following a plan. Trevor didn't stand when I walked into my office. He leaned back in my chair, took another sip from my mug, and watched me with the same calm expression he used during contract negotiations. If someone had walked past the open door, they would have assumed we were about to discuss quarterly sales instead of the fact that he had somehow taken my company. "I was hoping you'd come in," he said. I didn't answer. "I know you're upset." Still nothing. His smile faded just enough to make him look concerned instead of pleased. "This wasn't personal, Caleb." That sentence almost made me laugh. 17 years of friendship reduced to 4 words. I stayed where I was, just inside the doorway. "You've always been emotional," he continued. "That's why I handled the business side." Finally, I spoke. "You forged my signature." "I protected the company." "You stole it." "I saved it." His answer came so quickly it sounded rehearsed. That was the first time I realized he had probably practiced this conversation hundreds of times in his head. He slid a folder across the desk. "Sit down. Read everything." "I'll stand." He shrugged. "Your choice." Inside the folder were financial reports I had never seen, revenue charts, cash flow statements, debt schedules, several major contracts highlighted in yellow. At first I thought they were fake. Then I recognized the numbers. They were real, just incomplete. "You're wondering why you never saw these," Trevor said. I looked up. "We've been losing money for 18 months. "No." "Yes. We had record sales. We had record revenue." He emphasized the last word. "Revenue isn't profit." I kept reading. Some jobs had lost money. Equipment costs had increased. Steel prices had climbed. A large customer had delayed payments. Individually, none of it looked catastrophic. Together, it painted a business under pressure. "You hid this." "I managed it." "You never showed me these reports." "You never asked." That hit harder than I expected because it was partly true. I hated paperwork. Every month, Trevor summarized the finances in 5 minutes, and I accepted what he told me because I'd rather spend another hour on the production floor than another minute in front of spreadsheets. He knew that. He had always known that. "You trusted me," he said quietly. "Exactly. And I used that trust to keep the company alive." I closed the folder. "If things were so bad, why didn't you tell me?" "I did." "No. You just weren't listening." For a second, I actually questioned my own memory. Had there been conversations I dismissed? Meetings I skipped? Warnings I brushed aside? Trevor watched my face carefully. He could tell exactly what I was thinking. He smiled, not because he was happy, because doubt had entered the room. "You've always been brilliant with machines," he said. "That's your gift. Mine is seeing problems before everyone else." What problem justified forging my signature? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder. This one contained photographs. My truck, my house, the shop, me talking to suppliers, me loading equipment, even Hannah walking our dog one Saturday morning. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. "What is this?" "Preparation." "You had me followed?" "I hired investigators." "Why?" "Because I needed to know whether you'd become a liability." The words were so cold they barely sounded human. He said them the same way someone might discuss replacing an old compressor. "I found nothing," he continued. "No affair, no gambling, no addiction, no hidden debt." I stared at him. "So you invented one." "I created a solution." I realized then that Trevor genuinely believed every word he was saying. In his mind, he wasn't a thief. He was the only competent person left. The friendship we had built over nearly 2 decades existed only as long as it benefited him. The moment it became inconvenient, he rewrote the story until I was the obstacle. A knock interrupted us. Pete stepped into the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt," he said carefully. "There's someone here asking for Caleb." Trevor frowned. "Who?" Pete looked at me instead. He wouldn't give his name. "What's he look like?" "Older guy, gray coat, black briefcase." I had no idea who it could be. Trevor, however, suddenly stopped smiling. For the first time since I'd walked into that office, he looked genuinely uncomfortable, and that scared me more than anything he'd said. I stepped past Trevor without waiting for permission. "Caleb," he said as he stood up quickly, "this conversation isn't over." "It is for now," I said. I walked out of my office and followed Pete toward the reception area. Every employee in the shop suddenly seemed fascinated by whatever they were working on. Nobody looked directly at me, but I could feel every pair of eyes following me across the floor. An older man stood near the front entrance wearing a gray overcoat and carrying a black leather briefcase. He looked to be in his 60s, clean-shaven, with sharp blue eyes that missed very little. "Mr. Mercer?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "My name is Richard Collins," he said as he extended his hand. I shook it. "I'm sorry," I said. "Have we met?" "No," he said, "but I've been trying to reach you for almost a month." "I never got any messages," I said. "I suspected you wouldn't," he replied. He opened his briefcase and handed me a business card. "Richard Collins, Forensic Accounting Services." I looked at the card, then back at him. "What is this about?" I asked. Before Richard could answer, Trevor walked up behind me. "Richard," Trevor said with a polite smile, "I thought we settled this already." Richard didn't even turn around. "We didn't," he said. Trevor's smile became tighter. "I don't think this is the right place for this discussion," Trevor said. "I disagree," Richard replied. He looked at me again. "Mr. Mercer, I've sent certified letters to your home, emails to your company account, and several meeting requests over the last few weeks." "I never received any of them," I said. "I know," Richard said. I slowly turned toward Trevor. "You knew about this?" I asked. "I know a lot of people," Trevor said calmly. "That doesn't mean anything." Richard reached into his briefcase and removed a thick envelope. "I believe these belong to you," he said as he handed it to me. Trevor immediately stepped forward. "Those documents are company property," he said. "No," Richard said. "They're Mr. Mercer's." I opened the envelope and found spreadsheets, bank records, and copies of wire transfers. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Richard pointed to the first page. 8 months ago," he said, "your accountant noticed several payments to outside consulting firms." "We've hired consultants before," I said. "So I was told," Richard replied. "The problem is these companies don't appear to exist." I looked at Trevor. "What is he talking about?" I asked. Trevor shrugged. "Accounting mistakes happen," he said. Richard calmly shook his head. "One mistake, maybe," he said. "Not 43 separate payments." He turned another page. "The first quarter totaled just under $40,000, he said. Another page. "The second quarter exceeded $70,000. Another. "The third quarter passed $120,000. Finally, he placed the last page on top. "By the end of the year," he said, "the total had reached $784,000. I felt my throat go dry. "Where did the money go?" I asked. "3 corporations," Richard answered. "Different names, different states, same mailing address." He handed me another document. "Every one of those corporations was formed within the last 2 years, he said. I scanned the paperwork. The registered names were unfamiliar. The addresses were unfamiliar. Then I reached the signature page. Trevor Vance. I looked up slowly. "You signed these?" I asked. "They're legitimate businesses," Trevor said. "Are they yours?" I asked. "They're investments," he replied. "Answer the question," I said. "They're legal," he said. Richard folded his hands. "I spent 35 years investigating financial fraud," he said. "When money moves through shell corporations with no employees, no operating history, and no physical offices, I tend to ask questions." Trevor looked directly at him. "And did you find anything illegal?" he asked. "Not yet," Richard answered. Trevor smiled. Then we're finished. Richard smiled back. No, he said quietly. We're just getting started. I looked from one man to the other. Neither seemed surprised by the conversation. They had clearly been playing this game for weeks, maybe months. Finally, I looked at Trevor. You've been stealing from the company, I said. He looked me straight in the eyes. No, he said. He paused just long enough to make sure everyone nearby heard his next sentence. You're looking at the wrong theft. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Trevor's last sentence. I looked at him and frowned. What does that mean? I asked. Trevor folded his arms. It means you're asking the wrong questions, he said. Richard looked at Trevor without changing his expression. I don't think this is the time for games, Richard said. I'm not playing one, Trevor replied. I looked back at Richard. You said nearly $800,000 disappeared, I said. I did, Richard replied. And you're telling me Trevor moved it through shell companies? That's where the money went, Richard said. What I don't know is why. Trevor laughed quietly. You've spent months chasing bank transfers, he said. You never stopped to ask what happened before the money moved. Richard narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? He asked. Trevor looked at me. Caleb, do you remember the Jackson Steel contract? He asked. Of course I do, I said. It was our biggest job 3 years ago. And do you remember who negotiated it? You did. And who priced it? I did. Trevor nodded. Exactly. I didn't understand where he was going. It nearly buried us, he said. No, it didn't, I replied. That's because I fixed it. Richard opened his notebook. What did you fix? He asked. Trevor ignored him. You underbid that project by almost $600,000, he said to me. That's impossible, I said. It isn't. You approved every estimate. I corrected every estimate. I felt my patience disappearing. If that were true, why didn't you tell me? I tried, he said. No, I replied. You never said a word. You never listened. Richard interrupted us. Whether that's true or not doesn't explain the missing money, he said. It explains all of it, Trevor answered. Richard shook his head. No, it doesn't. Trevor smiled. It will. He walked over to the window overlooking the fabrication floor. You know what Caleb was always good at? He asked without turning around. Richard stayed silent. He could build anything. Trevor rested one hand against the glass. He'd walk through that shop, solve problems nobody else could solve, and somehow still believe the numbers would take care of themselves. I stared at him. So you decided to take the company. I decided to save it. By forging my name? You keep coming back to that. Because you forged it. Trevor finally turned around. Would you have signed if I'd asked? No. Exactly. Richard closed his notebook. I'm done listening, he said. Mr. Mercer deserves the truth. Trevor looked directly at him. The truth? Yes. Trevor nodded slowly. Fine. He reached into his suit pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper. I wasn't planning to show this today, he said. He handed it to me. What is it? I asked. You tell me. I unfolded the page. It was a bank statement. Not for the company. For me. I stared at the account number. It looked familiar. Too familiar. Then I realized why. It was one of my personal accounts. I looked at Trevor. How did you get this? I asked. You gave it to me years ago. I looked back at the statement. Several large deposits had been highlighted. $100,000, $75,000, $50,000, another 100. Each deposit had been made over the previous 18 months. I couldn't remember receiving any of them. What is this? I asked. Trevor's voice stayed calm. The account your accountant never told you about. I looked at Richard. He looked just as confused as I was. I've never seen this account, Richard said. I know, Trevor replied. I looked back at the statement. The signature card carried my name, my address, my social security number. Everything appeared legitimate, except I had never opened it. I slowly raised my eyes toward Trevor. You opened a bank account in my name, I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled. Then he said the one sentence that made me question everything I thought I knew. No, he said quietly. You opened it yourself. For several seconds, I couldn't take my eyes off the bank statement. The account number looked familiar enough to make me uneasy, but not familiar enough for me to remember ever opening it. My name was on every page, my address was correct, even my social security number matched. If someone had handed me the documents without any context, I would have believed they belonged to me. Richard asked if I recognized the account. I admitted that I didn't. Trevor didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked relieved that I had given the answer he expected. Richard took the statement from my hands and studied it again. He admitted that his investigation had uncovered the account only 2 weeks earlier. According to the records, it had existed for almost 4 years. During that time, hundreds of thousands of dollars had flowed through it before being transferred elsewhere. The problem was that every document connected to it appeared legitimate. The signature card looked authentic. The identification records matched mine. The account had even been opened in person at a local branch. Richard quietly asked whether I had ever lost my driver's license or passport. I told him I hadn't. Then something occurred to me. About 5 years earlier, Trevor had convinced me to leave work in the middle of the afternoon so we could meet with a banker about refinancing equipment loans. I remembered signing a stack of forms that day because we were in a hurry and the banker kept pointing at signature lines while Trevor joked that paperwork was the price of success. At the time, I hadn't read half the documents. I had trusted Trevor. As soon as the memory surfaced, I looked at him. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he simply smiled the way he always smiled when someone else had finally caught up to him. Richard noticed the change in my expression and asked what I had remembered. I explained the meeting as accurately as I could. The more I talked, the more details returned. It hadn't been just one appointment. There had been several over the years. Equipment financing, insurance renewals, credit applications, vendor agreements. Trevor had always organized everything in advance. I had simply signed wherever I was told because I believed we were working toward the same goal. Looking back, I realized something that made me sick. I couldn't remember reading a single page. Richard became very quiet. He admitted that identity theft usually happened all at once. What he was seeing here was different. Someone had spent years collecting legitimate signatures, legitimate documents, and legitimate opportunities until they could slowly build an entirely separate financial identity without raising suspicion. It wasn't one act of fraud. It was hundreds of small ones. That was why nobody noticed. Trevor had never needed to forge everything. He only needed to control enough pieces that the rest of the puzzle assembled itself. The more I thought about it, the more memories began surfacing. Trevor insisting that he handle every meeting with the accountant because numbers bored me. Trevor volunteering to keep copies of tax records because his office had better filing cabinets. Trevor offering to renew software licenses, insurance policies, payroll services, and banking credentials because he was already dealing with those companies anyway. At the time, every decision had seemed practical. Now they looked like steps in a plan. Richard finally closed his notebook. He admitted that his investigation had started because of suspicious vendor payments, but now he believed those transfers were only the final stage of something much larger. Whoever built this scheme had done it patiently, knowing that every year of trust made the next step easier. I looked across the reception area at Trevor. He wasn't watching me anymore. He was watching the employees. Only then did I understand what worried him. It wasn't Richard. It wasn't the missing money. It was the audience. Every welder, machinist, office assistant, and supervisor had stopped pretending not to listen. They weren't hearing accountants argue over numbers anymore. They were watching two business partners tell completely different versions of the same history. And for the first time since I had walked into the building, I noticed uncertainty on Trevor's face. He wasn't afraid of losing an argument. He was afraid of losing control of the story. That was when my phone vibrated. It was a text from Hannah. There were only 6 words. "Don't trust anyone. Check your email. Now." I opened my inbox. At the very top was an email I had never seen before. It had been sent 3 weeks earlier. The sender was anonymous. The subject line read, "Your partner isn't stealing your company. He's replacing you." I stepped away from everyone before opening the email. The sender's address was nothing but a string of random letters and numbers, and there was no signature at the bottom. It had been sent 23 days earlier, yet I had never seen it. Later, I would discover it had somehow been filtered into a folder I never checked, but at that moment, all I knew was that someone had tried to warn me. The message wasn't long. It said Trevor wasn't simply stealing my business. It claimed he had been preparing to replace me for years. Attached were 6 files. The first file contained copies of emails between Trevor and someone using only the initials DS. The messages went back almost 2 years. They discussed company restructuring, ownership percentages, and something they repeatedly called Phase 3. My name appeared only a handful of times, usually followed by comments about timing or risk. Reading them felt like overhearing strangers discuss my life while assuming I would never know they existed. The second attachment was even worse. It was my calendar. Not the version I remembered, but a detailed record of nearly every meeting I had attended during the previous 3 years. Certain appointments were highlighted in yellow: equipment financing, insurance renewals, meetings with the bank, meetings with the accountant. Every highlighted date matched a document Trevor had asked me to sign. Until then, I had believed those meetings were routine. Now they looked rehearsed. The third attachment contained photographs. Some showed Trevor walking into office buildings I didn't recognize. Others showed him meeting people I had never seen before. Every picture carried a date and timestamp. Whoever had gathered them had spent months following him. I realized someone else had suspected Trevor long before I did. Richard quietly asked if I was all right after noticing how long I'd been staring at my phone. I handed it to him without saying much. He read the email carefully, scrolling through each attachment with the same patience he had shown all morning. When he finished, he looked thoughtful rather than surprised. He admitted the information explained several gaps in his own investigation. Until then, he had believed the shell companies existed only to move money. The email suggested something larger. Trevor wasn't building fake businesses to hide stolen funds. He was building an entirely new company while using mine to finance it. That realization changed everything. It also explained why Trevor had seemed so calm. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to finish. As Richard continued reading, I noticed another attachment I had missed the first time. It was a spreadsheet listing employees. Every person at Mercer and Vance appeared on it. Next to each name was a note. Some employees were marked retain. Others were marked replace. A few had percentages written beside them, as though someone had estimated how likely they were to stay after the transition. My own name sat at the very top. Next to it were 3 words: remove before announcement. I must have read that line 10 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did. Trevor had never intended to push me aside gradually. He had planned a clean break. Once everything was legally positioned, I would simply disappear from the company's story. Clients would be told I had retired, employees would hear I was dealing with personal issues, suppliers would receive updated paperwork. Within a few months, new people would assume the business had always belonged to Trevor. It was a frighteningly simple plan. People don't question history when the paperwork agrees with it. Richard eventually handed my phone back. He admitted whoever sent the email had access to information that shouldn't have been public. Either someone inside Trevor's operation had lost confidence, or someone close to him had decided the plan had gone too far. Neither possibility made me feel better. As I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I noticed Trevor standing across the shop floor. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking toward the parking lot. His expression had changed completely. For the first time since I had arrived that morning, he looked genuinely unsettled. I followed his gaze. A dark blue sedan had just pulled into the lot. Two people stepped out. One was a woman carrying a banker's briefcase. The other was our accountant. Neither of them looked happy. The blue sedan changed the air in the shop. Nobody announced who had arrived, but everyone seemed to understand that the morning had just turned into something bigger. The woman with the briefcase walked beside our accountant, Evan Markham, a nervous man who usually looked like he had apologized before entering any room. That day, he looked exhausted, like he had been carrying a secret too long. I knew the woman from the bank. Her name was Marcy. Seeing her at my shop told me the problem had escaped the paperwork stage. Evan explained, mostly to me and Richard, that he had started questioning Trevor months earlier after noticing vendor payments that didn't match any work performed. At first, Trevor had supplied explanations that sounded reasonable. Then, Evan found missing invoices, altered approval records, and payment trails that looped back through companies with no employees. When Evan tried contacting me directly, every message bounced through an administrative inbox Trevor controlled. That was when Marcy stepped in. The bank had discovered inconsistencies after my loan meeting. Documents tied to Vance Industrial Holdings contained identification files that appeared valid, but some metadata showed they had been uploaded from our company network at strange hours. Worse, my supposed authorization signatures were connected to digital timestamps from days when I could prove I had been out of state visiting Hannah's parents. For the first time all morning, Trevor stopped acting amused. He tried to redirect everything back to business restructuring, but nobody followed him there. Evan laid out the pattern. Marcy confirmed the bank's concerns. Richard tied the shell companies to missing funds. I stood there listening to pieces of my life being arranged into evidence. What hurt most was realizing how long good people had been trying to reach me while Trevor stood between us, smiling. Then came the twist I still think about. Evan admitted he had not sent the anonymous email. Marcy had not sent it either. Richard said he hadn't. That meant someone else had been watching Trevor closely enough to know his plan, but quietly enough to stay hidden. Trevor noticed the same thing I did. His face went still. Not angry, not scared. Calculating. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and whatever he saw drained the remaining color from his face. He excused himself and tried to walk toward the back hallway, but Pete stepped into his path without making a scene. Pete didn't threaten him. He just stood there, arms crossed, blocking the way. That was when Trevor finally looked at me differently. Not like a partner, not like a victim, like an opponent. He said only one thing before his phone buzzed again. She wasn't supposed to know. I didn't ask who he meant. I already knew the name before I had proof. DS, the initials from the emails. A woman walked through the front door less than 5 minutes later. Early 40s, dark coat, hair pulled back, carrying a slim laptop bag. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her until Evan whispered her name. Dana Shaw, Trevor's former assistant. She had left our company 8 months earlier after what Trevor called a personality conflict. I remembered believing him. I remembered barely asking questions. Dana had always been quiet, efficient, and serious. Trevor said she had become unreliable. Now, I wondered what she had seen. Dana didn't look at Trevor first. She looked at me. Her expression wasn't friendly, but it was steady. She told me she had copied files before she left because she suspected Trevor was using my identity. She had sent warnings, but she had also been afraid. Trevor had threatened legal action, ruined her references, and made sure no local company would hire her. Then she opened her laptop. The first file was a video. It showed Trevor in my office months earlier, practicing my signature on yellow legal paper. I felt the room tilt. The second file was worse. It was audio from a meeting between Trevor and a notary. A meeting where my name was discussed like a problem to be solved. Dana looked at me and said she was sorry she hadn't come sooner. Trevor stared at her like she had committed the betrayal, and then he smiled. That smile told me he still had one move left. The smile on Trevor's face bothered me more than anything else that day. By then, Richard had bank records, Marcy had inconsistencies from the bank's internal review, Evan had months of accounting discrepancies, and Dana had files that placed Trevor at the center of everything. From where I stood, it looked over. Yet Trevor wasn't acting like a man whose plan had collapsed. He was acting like someone waiting for everyone else to discover they had missed something. I watched him carefully instead of speaking. For nearly 20 years, I had believed I knew how Trevor thought. That morning, I realized I had only known the version of himself he wanted me to see. The real Trevor was patient. He never argued when he could wait. He never rushed when time worked in his favor. If he still looked confident, there had to be a reason. Dana continued explaining what she had discovered during her final months at the company. She admitted that she hadn't understood the entire scheme at first. Small things had simply stopped making sense. Trevor had instructed her to create duplicate client files, maintain separate vendor lists, and prepare paperwork that never appeared in our official records. Whenever she asked questions, he always had an answer. Individually, every explanation sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She eventually began making copies of documents before deleting them, telling herself she was only protecting her own job if something ever went wrong. She never imagined she would be protecting mine. Richard reviewed everything she had brought. He occasionally asked short questions, but most of the conversation was spent comparing dates, signatures, transfers, and email records. The more they matched, the quieter the room became. Then Richard noticed something none of us had seen. Every suspicious transfer had occurred within 48 hours of one specific event. Not contract payments, not payroll, insurance renewals. Each time our commercial insurance policy had been updated, large amounts of money disappeared shortly afterward. At first it seemed unrelated, but Richard explained that insurance renewals required updated financial statements, ownership records, and corporate identification. Trevor had repeatedly used legitimate business transactions as cover for fraudulent ones. That was why nobody had questioned the paperwork. There was always real paperwork happening at the same time. I suddenly remembered how often Trevor insisted that renewal weeks were too busy for anyone else to get involved. I'd always been grateful he was willing to handle the administrative burden. Now I understood why. Every renewal created another opportunity. Every signature created another document he could reuse. Every routine meeting became another brick in the wall he was building around me. As those pieces came together, I found myself thinking less about the money and more about the years. 17 years of trust had given Trevor everything he needed. I hadn't been careless once. I had been predictable thousands of times. There was a difference. While everyone focused on Dana's files, I happened to glance toward Trevor's office. His desk was empty. For a second, I assumed he had stepped into the hallway. Then I noticed something else. His jacket was gone. So was the leather briefcase he carried everywhere. My stomach dropped. Without saying anything, I walked quickly toward the back corridor. The rear exit stood slightly open, letting cold February air drift into the building. Outside, fresh tire tracks cut through the thin layer of snow behind the loading dock. Trevor had left. Pete came running after me, followed by Richard and Evan. Nobody needed to ask what had happened. One look at the open door answered the question. I walked back into the office and looked around for anything he might have left behind. His computer was gone. Several file drawers were empty. The framed photograph of the two of us opening the business 17 years earlier had disappeared from the shelf. Only one thing remained on his desk: a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Trevor's handwriting. I picked it up, but didn't open it immediately. Something told me he had expected everything that had happened that morning. Something told me he had wanted me to find that letter only after he was gone. I broke the seal. The first sentence made my hands go numb. Trevor hadn't run away. According to the letter, he was going somewhere he had planned to reach from the very beginning. And he claimed I had unknowingly paid for every mile of the journey. I stood in my office for nearly a minute before opening the envelope. The room had fallen strangely quiet. The machines were still running out on the shop floor, but they sounded distant now. Richard, Evan, Dana, Marcy, and several employees waited without saying much. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever Trevor had left behind. The letter was only 2 pages long. I recognized Trevor's handwriting immediately. He began by saying that I would probably see the letter as a confession, but he insisted it wasn't. In his mind, it was an explanation. He wrote that people would eventually call him a thief because they only judged the ending, never the years that came before it. He claimed the company had started failing long before I realized it, and that I had been too focused on building products to notice what was happening behind the scenes. Reading those lines, I almost found myself believing him again. That was the frightening part. Trevor had always known exactly how to mix truth with lies. Yes, I had ignored paperwork. Yes, I had trusted him completely. Yes, I had signed documents too quickly. But none of those things explained what he had done. The second page removed any remaining doubt. Trevor admitted that he had started preparing his exit nearly 5 years earlier. At first, he only wanted leverage. He was afraid that if the business struggled, we would lose everything we had built. Slowly, that fear turned into opportunity. Every shortcut I took became another advantage for him. Every responsibility I delegated became another piece of control. Eventually, he realized he could separate me from the company without anyone noticing until it was finished. He even admitted that the shell companies had never been the final goal. They were distractions. He expected investigators to spend months following money while he disappeared somewhere they would never think to look. Near the end of the letter, he thanked me. Not sarcastically, genuinely. He wrote that without my engineering skills, work ethic, and reputation, none of his plans would ever have succeeded. Clients trusted the company because they trusted me. Banks approved financing because of my history. Suppliers extended credit because of relationships I had spent years building. In the cruelest way imaginable, Trevor admitted that I had always been the company's greatest asset. He had simply decided to use that asset for himself. When I reached the final paragraph, I stopped reading. Richard quietly asked if everything was all right. I handed him the letter without answering. While he read it, I looked around the office. My office. For the first time all day, I realized something important. Trevor had taken the corporation. He had taken the accounts. He had taken the paperwork. But he hadn't taken the people. Pete was still there. Evan was still there. Dana had come back despite everything she had lost. Even several employees who had quietly gathered outside the office hadn't gone anywhere after learning the truth. One by one, they had stayed. That mattered more than I had understood. Richard eventually finished reading the letter and quietly folded it. He explained that Trevor had made one critical mistake. He had documented too much. His confidence had convinced him that nobody would ever assemble all the pieces. Instead, every email, transfer, shell company, and handwritten note formed a timeline that investigators could now follow. For the first time that day, I felt something other than anger. Relief. Not because the fight was over, because I finally understood what I still had. Over the following months, the investigation expanded. Several of Trevor's corporations were frozen, while authorities reviewed the financial records. The civil case took much longer, but enough evidence surfaced to unwind many of the fraudulent transfers. Recovering everything proved impossible, yet the business itself survived. It wasn't easy. Some contracts were lost. Some clients never returned. A few employees chose different jobs, but most stayed. We rebuilt under the original company name because nobody wanted to erase its history. People often ask me whether I ever heard from Trevor again. I didn't. The last thing I ever received from him was that letter. Sometimes I think about the young men we used to be, working in that tiny rented garage, convinced that success depended on talent and hard work alone. I was wrong. Talent builds a business. Trust builds a partnership. And when trust is given to the wrong person, it can become the most valuable thing anyone ever steals. So that's my story. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. If you liked my story, then subscribe to my channel, give it a like, and write in the comments where you watch me from, or whatever you want. Bye-bye.